One of the first things that we need to make sure we understand is going to be that Pythagorean theorem. So we're going to go ahead and write in, we know we have x squared plus y squared equals r squared. And we're going to relabel some of these things. We're going to let x, that's going to be kind of what we consider for cosine, and y is going to be what we consider for sine, and r is going to be the hypotenuse. So the way that we're going to relabel these is going to be, with sine, we know we had opposite over hypotenuse. But when we're going to go around the Cartesian plane, we're going to relabel that to be y over r. And so that would automatically imply that cosecant is r over y. And then we're going to associate cosine with x. So instead of having adjacent over hypotenuse, we're going to relabel that to be x over r. So then secant is r over x. And cotangent, instead of having opposite over adjacent, we're going to relabel that to be y over x. And so cotangent is going to be x over y. So again, we're relabeling these. If you need to put this on a note card to help you remember what they're changing to, by all means do so. All right, let's use this with some problems. All right, looking at number 1. With number 1, we know that we're given an ordered pair here. So I know x is going to be 9. I know y is going to be negative 12. And so if I knew what r was, then we could go through and list out all of our ratio values. So we're going to go back to our Pythagorean theorem. We're going to have 9 squared plus negative 12 squared equals r squared. So that's going to be 81 plus 144 equals r squared. So that's going to give us 225. So r squared. So r is going to be 15. Now we can certainly draw out the triangle around, but we don't have to. We're welcome to use this like it is. And then go through our ratios. We know that sine, we're now relabeling that to be y over r, right? So let's go take our y value, which is negative 12, over the r value, 15, and then reduce that. So that's going to give us negative 4 over 5, isn't it? So then that would automatically tell us that for cosecant, that's going to be negative 5 over 4. And we're going to do the same thing for cosine. Cosine, we are told now that it's x over r. So our x value is going to be 9. So I have 9 over 15. And then if I reduce that, that's going to give me 3 over 5. So I know secant is 5/3. And then the same for tangent. We know tangent is y over x. And so our y value was negative 12. Our x value was 9. And when we reduce that, we get negative 4 over 3, which tells me cotangent is negative 3 over 4. Okay, now we've got a different point. So let's go through. Again, the concept's still the same. We know from what we're given that x is, if it'll write, is negative 6. I know y is negative 2, don't we? And so we need to find r. So again, we know x squared, so negative 6 all squared, plus y squared equals r squared. So we have 36 plus 4 equals r squared. So we have r squared is 40. Now we're going to have the square root of 40. And so we need to break that down. So over here to the side, a quick reminder, 40 can be broken apart as 4 times 10. And so we have the square root of 4 times the square root of 10. The square root of 4 is 2, so I have 2 times the square root of 10. We leave that root 10 because the square root of 10 is a lot, big decimal mess, so we're going to leave it in exact form. So now I know r is 2 times the square root of 10. Now we can do our ratios again. So sine was y over r, so that's negative 2 over 2 square root of 10. Now we do need to rationalize this, and we'll rationalize for a little bit longer and then we're going to stop. Before you do anything, notice those 2's will cancel. So that's negative 1 over the square root of 10. I would go ahead here and do the reciprocal before I do any rationalizing. That way it'll be a little bit easier for us. So instead of negative 1 over 10, remember down here for cosecant, I need that reciprocal. And so that's just going to be negative square root of 10 over 1, which is just square root of 10. Now we can come back up and go ahead and rationalize. Multiply top and bottom by the square root of 10. So negative 1 times square root of 10 is negative square root of 10 over square root of 10 times square root of 10, square root of 100, which is 10. Okay, now let's look at cosine. Cosine, we had x over r, so that's going to be 6 over 2 square root of 10. Again, I would cancel that 2 into the 6. That's going to leave a 3. And then I would immediately go down here and write the secant value, which is going to be square root of 10 over 3. Okay, now going back up, let's multiply top and bottom by the square root of 10. We need to rationalize. And so when we multiply that, that's 3 times the square root of 10 over 10. And then finally, looking at tangent, that's going to be y over x. So that's going to be negative 2 over negative 6. So that's going to give us 1/3. So cotangent is 3. All right, so on this, we need to review our quadrants. And again, we talked about all students. We're going to say takes calculus. That's a little bit nicer to put it. But again, you may memorize it. However, now translating this, do keep in mind that this means that all trig functions are positive. And that means also if I were to plot a point, both x and y are positive. And again, we associated the x coordinates. That's going to go really with cosine of an angle. And the y coordinates, we said, went with which function? Sine of the angle. And then how did we define tangent? It was y over x. That's your tangent. And if we understand and relate that back to ordered pairs, it makes a lot of sense about why what is positive and why what is negative. So let's go ahead and go through the second quadrant. We have sine, but why is sine the only one that's positive there? Well, if you were to plot a point, you would have to go left, and then you would have to go up, wouldn't you? So cosine is negative, sine is positive, if you had to plot a point in that second quadrant. Now, what about in the third quadrant? You would have to go left, and then you would have to go down, wouldn't you? And if I define tangent to be y over x, a negative over a negative is a positive. That is why tangent is positive in the third quadrant. And then in the fourth quadrant, you would have to move to the right and then down to get to that quadrant. So that tells me cosine's positive, sine is negative, positive divided by a negative is a negative, so tangent's negative. All of that relates to each other. We need to make sure we have that in our minds. Now, again, a little bit of abbreviating with Quadrant 1. Again, all trig functions are positive. Quadrant 2, only sine is positive, and it's reciprocal, and that reciprocal was cosecant, wasn't it? And then in the third quadrant, tangent, and tangent's reciprocal, which was cotangent. And then in the fourth quadrant, only cosine and secant. And all the other trig functions have to be negative if you are in that quadrant. All right, so another way to look at number 3, we went through it, but it can be confusing to remember that. So what I would do, maybe another way to think of it, let's go ahead and put ASTC, because that's always true. And then look at what you're given. You have ASTC, that's all trig functions, sine, tangent, and cosine. Now look at what we're told. Cosine is positive. So if cosine is positive, we're not in that second quadrant, nor are we in the third quadrant. So that leaves me the first quadrant, or I can be in the fourth quadrant because all trig functions are positive in the first, and only cosine is positive in the fourth. That's why it is the first and fourth quadrants. If we look at number 4, again, we can do ASTC. Okay, now let's mark out what we know. Notice it says tangent is negative, isn't it? Tangent is negative. So if tangent's negative, I can't be where all trig functions are positive, right? And where else can I not be if tangent is negative? Third quadrant. So what 2 quadrants does that leave us? Second and fourth. That's why we're in the second and fourth. And again, that ASTC is just telling us where we're positive. Let's go through this one. ASTC again. But now we're given secant. What is secant the reciprocal of? Cosine. Secant is 1 over cosine. So this is saying that cosine is negative. Cosine is negative. So I should be able to mark out the first quadrant. And what other quadrant can I mark out? The fourth. Because again, cosine's positive in the fourth. So what 2 quadrants are left? The second and third. Okay, same idea over here with number 6. Okay, and again, I would go through ASTC. And the first thing we're told, sine is negative. Sine is negative. Well, I know automatically it can't be all, right? So first quadrant's gone. If sine is negative, first quadrant's out. What about the other quadrants? What other quadrant should be gone if sine is negative? The second one, right? Because that S means sine is positive. Right, so I have third and fourth, but now I've got another condition that I have to consider. Cotangent is positive. I know cotangent is the same thing as 1 over tangent, right? So I need to make sure tangent is positive. What quadrant is that going to have to be in if tangent has to be positive? It's going to have to be this one, right? Quadrant 3. That's what that T is telling me, that tangent is positive there. So I know for this one we have quadrant 3. Okay, so again, let's talk about how we assign certain things. Now, we were told earlier that sine, if we had sine of an angle, that was y over r. We relabeled it to be y over r. Instead of opposite over hypotenuse, we said y over r. And then we also talked about cosine. Cosine, we labeled that to be x over r. And then we talked about tangent. And tangent was y over x. And that's how we relabel these, because we're no longer just looking at a triangle. We're on the Cartesian plane and we are moving around through all the quadrants. So it's a little bit better to relabel it like this. Now to find r, we also knew x squared plus y squared equals r squared. Pythagorean Theorem. We knew that as well. Okay, so we need to find r, and then we also need to figure out, well, what quadrant are we in? We can do all of that. Let's go ahead and find r, though. Or not r, I'm sorry. Let's find x, because I know y for this. Y is going to be 8, isn't it? R is 17, so we don't know what x is. That's what we've got to go find. So we're going to have x squared plus 8 squared equals 17 squared. And this is a Pythagorean triple. I want to say x would have to be 15. X is 15. And we can do all the calculator numbers, but I'm pretty confident that's 15. Okay. And we can go ahead and we can go through and do all of our trig ratios, can't we? We now have enough information to do that. And then the last thing, we'll go back and assign some signs to it. So let's go through our trig ratios. Well, cosine we said was x over r. So x was 15, r was 17, right? So we're going to do 15 over 17. Well, if I know cosine, then I'm going to go do the reciprocal right quick, because I can flip a fraction over. So that's going to be 17 over 15. Okay, so now let's talk about tangent. Tangent is y over x. So y over x. So that's going to be 8 over 15, isn't it? So automatically, let's go down to the reciprocal and put 15 over 8. And then cosecant, well, that's the reciprocal of what I'm given, right? So that's going to be 17 over 8. All right, now let's go figure out our signs. So I'm going to have A, S, T, C again. Notice that the sign ratio is positive, isn't it? Y'all see that? Sign is positive 8 over 17. So if sign is positive, then I have to be in either the first quadrant or the second quadrant, because in the first quadrant, all trig functions are positive. Second quadrant, only sine is positive. So I'm going to throw out cosine and tangent. Third and fourth, get going. Okay, now what quadrant would I have to be in so that tangent is negative? Which of the remaining two? Can I be in the first quadrant and tangent be negative? No. So we throw that out. So notice that we're in the second quadrant. Sine and cosecant are the only ones that are positive. So all the other trig functions that I have written have to be negative. So I can just throw in my signs. Okay, so for number 8, notice that you're given cotangent. And so right off the bat, we know tangent is going to have to be that reciprocal, so it's negative 1/4. So over here to the side, I already know negative 1/4 there. All right, so let's go through and see. That's going to give me an x value of 4 and a y value of 1. Now, I cannot attach a negative because I don't know if that negative came from the top or the bottom. And I can't put it both because then it would make it positive. So that's why you have to go check your signs to see what quadrant you're in. So don't worry about those signs at the moment. We'll attach those at the end. Now, let's see. We need to find r. So in order to do that, again, we're going to have our x squared plus our y squared equals r squared. So it looks like we're going to get square root of 17. That's going to be the r value. Is that okay? Questions? All right, now let's go through and list our trig values. So here we're going to have sine, which is y over r. So I'm going to have 1 over the square root of 17. So if I rationalize that, that's the square root of 17 over 17, isn't it? So then I know automatically cosecant, and that's going to be the square root of 17. And now cosine is going to be x over r. So that's going to be 4 times the square root of 17 all over 17 if you rationalize. And so we know secant then is going to be the square root of 17 all over 4. All right, so now we have all those values. We need to find what quadrant we'll be in. So again, A, S, T, C. And let's see, for the quadrant, we're told that tangent is negative. So we can't be in the first quadrant with a negative trig function. If tangent's negative, we can't be in the third quadrant. So that leaves us with either the second or the fourth, and that's why we need this. If secant is positive, then that means cosine is also positive, isn't it? So that tells me that cosine and secant need to be positive, but all the rest of them are negative. So I'm going to have a negative sign, and then I'm going to have a negative secant. Okay, so for number 9, if we're given cosecant is the negative square root of 5 over 2, then I know automatically that sine of theta is going to be negative 2 over the square root of 5, isn't it? And so over here, if I rationalize that, I'm going to have negative 2 root 5 all over 5. That also tells me that I know a y value and I know an r value. So I should be able to find x. So we're going to say x squared plus our y value squared is going to equal the square root of 5 squared. Isn't that just going to be 5, right, if you do that? So that tells me x squared is going to be 1. So x should just be 1. So then y was 2, and r was the square root of 5. So we can go through and list off all of our ratios and then go back and see if we can figure out our sine. So for cosine, that's going to be x over r. So 1 over the square root of 5, or square root of 5 over 5. I would go ahead and do secant since I have that. That's just root 5. Tangent was y over x, so that's going to be 2 over 1, or 2. So cotangent is 1/2. Now let's see if we can find what quadrant we're in. Again, ASTC, that's listing all of the positives. So notice both sine is negative. So if sine's negative, that gets rid of the first and second. But also cosine is negative, isn't it? So that's going to get rid of the fourth quadrant. So tangent's going to be the only trig function that's positive here. So everything else that we see besides tangent and cotangent should be negative for our answers. Okay, so looking at number 1, it is a good idea to go ahead and plot 150 degrees. And a bit of a review here going around your XY axis. Do remember this is going to be at 0 degrees. This up here is at 90 degrees. Out here is 180. Down here is 270. You also have your radian measures that y'all talked about, but just a good reminder with that. 0 degrees is still 0 radians. 90 is going to be pi over 2. 180 is going to be pi. 270 is 3 pi over 2. And then all the way back around to 360 is also 2 pi. So you could be asked any number of those all the way around the XY axis. So for 150 degrees, keep in mind that's going to be over here in the second quadrant. So this is going to be your given of 150 degrees. That's your theta. So what they talk about when they're wanting a reference angle, that reference angle or alpha is talking about the angle inside here. That's going to be your reference angle, in which we can look at that and pretty much will reason that, hey, that's going to be 30 degrees, isn't it? That's got to be your reference angle. So here, again, alpha, that's going to be 30 degrees. Does that make sense why it's 30? In number 2, you're given that you have a given angle of 315 degrees. So 315 is almost all the way around. So we're going to start here at 0. 315 is going to end somewhere here. So there's your given. So theta is 315. So alpha, or our reference angle, again is going to be the part that's inside here. And you're always going in relation to the x-axis. Never go back in relation to the y-axis. It's always in terms of x. So what would be our reference angle there? It's going to be 45, isn't it? So here we're going to have alpha equals 45 degrees. Now if you're not sure, keep in mind that you're in the 4th quadrant and you could always do 360 minus that. Okay, now let's look at number 3. You have a negative angle, you've got negative 240. The best way to get rid of that negative, and I know last year y'all were probably told to go in opposite direction, but really if we'll just take that negative 240 and we're going to add to that 360, what does that give us? That's going to be 120. So negative 240 is coterminal, or in the same exact spot as 120 degrees. And so that tells me I can go ahead and plot that 120 degrees and still get the same exact answer as I would if I went through and did negative 240. So again, I'm going to have 120 degrees, so that's going to be up here somewhere. So my given is 120. So what would have to be our reference angle inside here? What would have to be alpha? Awesome. It's going to be 60 degrees, isn't it? Questions about that?